He laughed. Not a cruel laugh, exactly. More like one of those dismissive chuckles men give when they think you've said something cute but impossible. I remember the way his coffee cup paused mid-air, his mouth curling into that half smile. "You? Start a company? Linda, be serious," he'd said. That sound stayed with me longer than it should have. It echoed even later that night, in my quiet kitchen in Asheville, North Carolina. The same kitchen where the refrigerator hum was louder than any conversation I'd had in weeks. I'd just turned 54 that winter, and outside, the Blue Ridge winds were blowing the first flakes of snow across my porch. Before we begin, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I love knowing how far our stories travel. Anyway, that was my life back then. Ordinary, predictable, maybe even invisible. I worked as an administrative coordinator at a logistics firm that handled freight for half the southeastern states. 12 years in that gray office, answering phones, writing reports, fixing other people's mistakes, smiling through meetings where my voice barely registered. They like to call me the reliable one. What that really meant was that I kept the chaos from spilling over, while the men took credit for holding the line. It wasn't always like that. In my 30s, I had dreams, big ones. I used to imagine starting a small operations agency, something efficient and honest. But life has a way of shushing dreams when you're a woman trying to raise a daughter alone, juggling bills and expectations. Still, even then, a part of me was restless. I'd see gaps in our process, ideas to make shipments faster, communication smoother. I'd bring them up, and every time, my suggestions would be brushed aside. "That's not really your department, Linda." I learned to swallow my words, one by one, until that afternoon in the break room. I had just finished explaining a concept, a new scheduling system that could save us thousands. He, a younger analyst with a degree and an ego, laughed. "You should leave this to the tech guys. No offense, but that's a little out of your league." I remember how my face burned, but I didn't say anything. I just nodded and walked back to my desk, clutching the paper like it was something fragile I shouldn't have brought into the light. That night, I drove home with the radio off. The silence in my car felt heavier than traffic. I kept replaying that laugh, that smirk. It wasn't just about him. It was every boss who'd ignored me, every meeting I'd been left out of, every time someone assumed my ideas stopped mattering after 40. I poured myself a cup of tea, sat by the window, and wrote one line on a napkin. "He won't be laughing forever." It wasn't revenge. It was a promise to myself. Over the next few weeks, something shifted. I started paying closer attention at work. Not to people, but to systems. I noticed how clients complained about miscommunication. I noticed how paperwork got lost between departments. I noticed that no one actually understood the heartbeat of the company, the little things that kept the trucks moving and the numbers clean. And then I realized, I did. Every mistake they made, I'd already fixed in silence. Every process they claimed to innovate, I'd been quietly maintaining for years. Maybe that's when the spark really started. Not from anger, but from clarity. I wasn't dreaming too big. They were thinking too small. And as that snow fell harder outside, I whispered the first quiet what if I'd said aloud in years. What if I just tried? It sounded ridiculous, even to me, but something inside answered back. Try anyway. That was the night everything started to change. I didn't know it then, but humiliation would become my best teacher. And that single laugh, that moment of smallness, would become the fuel that carried me further than I ever imagined. The following months felt like living two lives at once. By day, I was still Linda the Reliable, the woman who never complained, who brought homemade banana bread to the office, who trained new hires half her age. By night, I was someone else, the woman who stayed up reading articles about business management, listening to free podcasts about entrepreneurship, jotting notes in a worn-out notebook I found in my daughter's old room. At first, it felt almost childish, like sneaking dreams past a curfew. But the more I learned, the more alive I felt. Then came the day that broke me. It was a Wednesday, ordinary gray like any other. We'd just lost a big client because of scheduling errors, and I spent 3 days straight fixing the damage. Late emails, phone calls, spreadsheets, the works. I barely slept. When the issue was finally resolved, my manager called a meeting. He praised the team's innovation, specifically highlighting him, the same young coworker who'd laughed at me months before. My idea, my system, my work, credited to him. I sat there smiling because that's what women my age are taught to do. But inside, something collapsed. It wasn't just anger, it was grief for all the years I'd spent being small so others could feel big. That evening, as the office emptied, he passed my desk and said, "Thanks for the help, Linda. You're a lifesaver." It sounded almost kind, but I knew better. When I got home, I didn't even take off my coat. I walked straight to my desk, opened my laptop, and typed a resignation letter. No drama, no tears, just facts. Then I sat back and stared at it for a long time. The cursor blinked like a heartbeat. Could I really do this? Start from nothing at 54? The fear was real. It clawed at every corner of my mind. But then I remembered that laugh, that smirk, that meeting. And the fear started to feel smaller than the thought of spending one more year being unseen. I clicked print. The sound of the printer spitting out that page felt louder than any applause I'd ever gotten. That night, I poured myself a glass of cheap wine, raised it to the empty room, and said out loud, to courage, and to every woman who's ever been told she's too late. When I handed in that letter the next morning, my hands were trembling, but my voice was steady. My manager blinked, surprised. "Linda, what are you going to do?" I smiled. "Something you'll probably laugh at." He didn't get the joke. I walked out of that building into the spring air, free and terrified. I didn't have investors or plans, only an idea, a laptop, and a lifetime of lessons they'd never paid attention to. But that was enough, because what they didn't know was that every no, every overlooked idea, every polite smile had built something stronger in me. A kind of resilience that doesn't fade with age, it sharpens. And as I drove home that day, I knew one thing for certain. He'd laughed once, he wouldn't laugh again. Freedom feels heavier than you expect. That first Monday after quitting, I woke up early out of habit, made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table. The same one where I'd once balanced bills and broken hopes. Only this time, there was no office to go to, no one waiting for my reports, no familiar hum of the copier down the hall. Just silence. And a laptop. It hit me then. I wasn't unemployed. I was unchained. I told myself I'd give it 6 months. 6 months to see if this dream had legs, or if I just made the most foolish decision of my life. I named my company Clear Path Consulting. It sounded simple, steady, like the kind of help I wished I'd had when I was buried under someone else's chaos. Before we go further, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I love seeing how far stories like this reach. My first office was the dining table, cluttered with sticky notes, unpaid bills, and one stubborn orchid that refused to bloom. My daughter Jenna was skeptical at first, but supportive in that half-worried, half-proud way adult children are. "Mom," she'd said, "you've built other people's companies for decades. Maybe it's time you build your own." I clung to that sentence like a lifeline. The first few weeks were brutal. I made cold calls that went nowhere. I sent out 50 emails and got 3 replies. 2 were polite rejections, and 1 was a scam offering partnership for exposure. I stayed up late watching free webinars about invoicing, marketing, client acquisition, topics I'd never had to think about before. I learned how to design my own website using tutorials and stubbornness. I rewrote my bio a dozen times, trying to sound confident without sounding desperate. Every time doubt crept in, I reminded myself, I've survived worse. I remembered the way they used to dismiss me. It's not your department, Linda. Well, now everything was my department. The days blurred together. Coffee, spreadsheets, learning curves. Some nights, exhaustion made me cry quietly at my desk. Other nights, I'd look at my screen and feel that spark again. That same spark that had carried me out of that gray cubicle. Then, one evening, just as I was about to shut down for the night, an email came through. Subject line, inquiry, small logistics support needed. It was from a local trucking company, family-owned, struggling to streamline their scheduling. They couldn't afford big firms, but they needed help. I met with them at a diner 2 days later. The owner, a gruff man in his 60s named Hank, was skeptical but kind. "You sure you can handle this yourself?" he'd asked. I smiled. "Sir, I've been handling other people's messes for 20 years. I think I can handle one more." That meeting changed everything. It wasn't a glamorous contract, but it was real. I spent nights fine-tuning their routes, digitizing their paperwork, and creating clear reporting systems. Within a month, their delivery times improved by 30%. That meeting changed everything. It wasn't a glamorous contract, but it was real. I spent nights fine-tuning their routes, digitizing their paperwork, and creating clear reporting systems. Within a month, their delivery times improved by 30%. Word spread quietly, not through ads, but through reputation. I still remember the day Hank called me and said, "You've saved my business, Linda. I don't know how you did it, but thank you." I hung up and cried, not from sadness, from relief, from pride, from the realization that my dream had a pulse now. Still, the fear never disappeared. Some days, I'd stare at my empty inbox and wonder if this was just beginner's luck. But even when the fear came, I kept going. Because deep down, I knew the truth. I hadn't come this far just to stop when things got hard. Every late night, every rejection, every mistake, they were teaching me something the corporate world never did. That failure is part of growth, not proof of inadequacy. And so, slowly, ClearPath Consulting began to find its footing. I wasn't rich, I wasn't powerful, but I was building something that couldn't be taken from me. It was mine, and that made all the difference. Success doesn't arrive in a straight line. It comes in tremors, in bursts, in moments where you almost quit before the tide turns. After that first client, things began to move. Not fast, but steady. I got referrals through word of mouth. Small businesses trusted me because I didn't talk like a salesman. I talked like someone who understood what it meant to scrape by. Within a year, I had 5 clients, all modest, all loyal. My little company was growing, and so was my confidence. I upgraded from my dining table to a shared workspace downtown. It wasn't much. 1 desk, a window facing a brick wall, and a coffee pot that sputtered more than it brewed. But it was mine. I hired a part-time assistant, a single mom named Carla who'd been laid off during the pandemic. She reminded me so much of myself at that age, tired but determined. We became a team, 2 women rebuilding their lives, 1 invoice at a time. But success brings new storms. Clients started paying late. One big account defaulted on their payment altogether. Rent, software, insurance. Everything added up faster than I'd planned. I maxed out a credit card just to keep things afloat. For a while, I told no one, not even Jenna. I didn't want anyone to see the cracks forming. There were nights when I stared at my computer screen, watching the numbers bleed red, whispering, maybe they were right. Maybe you are too old for this. It's a dangerous thing when doubt starts to sound like reason. Then one morning, I opened my inbox to find the worst possible email. My biggest client, the one that covered nearly half my monthly revenue, had pulled out. I felt the air leave the room. That entire day, I moved like I was underwater, emailing, apologizing, calculating losses. By sunset, I realized I might have to shut everything down. See, that night, I didn't cry. I just sat there in the quiet, feeling the exhaustion of every battle I'd fought alone. I closed my eyes and whispered a prayer. Not for money, not even for success, but for a sign. Some small sign that I wasn't foolish for believing in myself. 2 days later, the phone rang. It was a voice I hadn't heard in years, an old client contact from my corporate days. He'd started working at a larger shipping company. They were looking for a consultant to help reorganize their logistics department. I thought of you immediately, he said. You've got a reputation for fixing the impossible. My first instinct was fear. The company was huge, too big for me. I almost said no, but then I heard my own words echoing from that diner meeting months before. I've been handling other people's messes for 20 years. I think I can handle one more. So I said yes. I didn't know it yet, but that single phone call would change everything. Because sometimes, just when you think your story is ending, life quietly turns the page. Walking into that company's headquarters felt like stepping into another world. Polished glass walls, gleaming floors, and people who moved with the kind of confidence I'd only ever seen from the outside. I remember sitting in the lobby, clutching my folder, wondering if they could tell that my shoes were scuffed, or that the blazer I wore had seen one too many interviews. My stomach fluttered, not from fear exactly, but from the weight of what this meeting could mean. When they called me in, I expected another round of polite nods and empty promises. But then he walked in, Mr. Turner, the CEO himself. Older man, maybe early 60s, with that calm presence of someone who didn't waste words. He didn't look at me like I was taking up his time. He looked at me like I might actually have something to say. That alone was new. So, he said, I hear you're the woman who fixes things other people overlook. I smiled, even though my palms were sweating. I guess you could say that. He leaned back. Then fix this, he said, handing me a report. For the next 40 minutes, I forgot my nerves. I pointed out errors, inefficiencies, patterns they'd missed. I spoke like someone who knew what she was doing. Because I did. Years of quiet observation had turned into expertise no degree could match. When I finished, there was silence. Then Mr. Turner smiled. You're the first person who's made sense of this in months. Let's give you a shot. That single sentence cracked open a door I'd been knocking on my whole life. The pilot contract lasted. I poured myself into it, working nights, tracking shipments, visiting warehouses, talking to drivers. I treated their problems like my own because, in a way, they were. When the results came in, improved delivery rates, reduced costs, better morale, the numbers spoke louder than any pitch deck could. Mr. Turner called me into his office. You didn't just fix the system, he said. You fixed the people running it. And then, in a tone that still makes my chest tighten when I remember it, he added, Linda, I think we should talk about a partnership. For a moment, I thought I'd misheard him. Partnership? Me? The woman who'd been laughed at for even dreaming of starting her own company? He wasn't joking. That night, I sat in my car outside their building, staring at the city lights. I thought about every rejection, every late-night tear, every whisper that said I was too old, too naive, too late. And I smiled, because maybe too late was just another word for finally ready. What I didn't know then was that fate still had one more surprise waiting for me. The partnership announcement went live 6 months later. ClearPath Consulting was officially collaborating with Turner Freight Group, a deal that put us on the map overnight. I hired more staff, expanded operations, and finally moved into a real office. The new space smelled like fresh paint and second chances. The first thing I did was hang a small sign on the wall that said, "Built from what they overlooked." Life had changed, not suddenly, but profoundly. We were invited to strategy meetings, corporate events, and industry panels. Every time I walked into a room filled with executives, I carried every invisible woman with me, the ones who'd been told they were past their prime, who'd been interrupted mid-sentence, who'd done the work and watched someone else get the credit. Then one morning, Mr. Turner called me into his office for a high-level merger discussion. I walked into the boardroom, sleek, glass-topped, crowded with people in tailored suits, and froze for a second. Sitting at the far end of the table was a familiar face. It was him, a man who had laughed all those years ago. He looked almost the same smug tilt of the chin, though now softened by years that hadn't been kind. But the moment our eyes met, his confidence faltered. For a brief second, I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Mr. Turner began introductions, unaware of the history in the room. "Linda, I'd like you to meet Thomas. He's part of the management team from the company we're merging with." Thomas. The name fit differently now. Smaller somehow. I extended my hand. "We've met," I said, my voice calm, steady. "It's been a long time." He hesitated, then shook it. His grip was weaker than I remembered. Throughout the meeting, I spoke clearly, decisively, outlining the consulting approach, discussing logistics and systems with confidence he could never have imagined me possessing back then. Every time I caught him glancing my way, I didn't feel anger. I felt closure, because revenge wasn't my story anymore. Growth was. When the meeting ended, he lingered, perhaps hoping to say something, but I simply smiled, nodded, and left the room. As I walked down the hallway, the weight of the past years washed over me. The laughter, the doubt, the fear, the nights I'd questioned my worth. And now here I was, not his subordinate, not his competition, but his equal, in a room he once believed I'd never belong to. That's the thing about starting over. Sometimes life brings you full circle, not to prove others wrong, but to show you how far you've come. He had laughed at my dream, but now I was sitting at the same table as his boss's partner. And the only sound louder than that old laughter was the silence that followed when respect finally took its place. After that meeting, something inside me shifted. Not in a triumphant, cinematic way, but in a quiet, deeply human one. For years, I'd carried the echoes of his laughter like a scar that refused to fade. It had fueled me, driven me, haunted me. But now that I stood on the other side of it, I realized I didn't need that noise anymore. Success, it turns out, doesn't taste like revenge. It tastes like peace. And next few months were some of the busiest and most meaningful of my life. The merger was demanding, and my schedule left little time for rest. But I found purpose in every detail, in mentoring younger women in the office, in watching them find their voices in rooms that used to silence them. One day, a young analyst named Priya came into my office, nervous but determined. "Ma'am," she said, "sometimes I feel like people don't take me seriously here." I smiled, recognizing that fear. I'd lived it for years. "They will," I said softly. "But first, you have to take yourself seriously. Speak like your ideas already matter, because they do." She nodded, and something in her eyes lit up, the same spark I used to hide. That's when I realized the real transformation wasn't that I built a company, or signed a partnership, or proven anyone wrong. It was that I'd learned how to lift others up where I once had to climb alone. Mr. Turner noticed too. "You've changed the energy in this company," he said one evening as we reviewed a proposal. "You've brought something numbers can't measure." I smiled. "That's because I remember what it's like to be unseen." He nodded thoughtfully. "That's your strength, Linda. You don't just lead, you understand." And maybe that was the real secret. Understanding. Understanding how rejection can turn into resilience, how loss can turn into learning, and how doubt can turn into drive. When I finally saw Thomas again, a few months later, it wasn't awkward. He approached me after a conference, hands in pockets, eyes softer now. "I underestimated you," he said quietly. "I shouldn't have." I smiled. "Maybe not. But if you hadn't, I might never have pushed this far." He looked at me for a long moment and then nodded. "Guess life's funny that way." "Yes," I said. "It really is." As he walked away, I felt lighter. No bitterness, no need to gloat. Just gratitude for the journey, for the lessons, and for the woman I'd become. That was my transformation. Not from failure to success, but from proving myself to knowing myself. Because in the end, success isn't about getting the last laugh. It's about finally being too busy building your own table to notice who's watching. Looking back now, it's hard to believe how one moment of mockery could set the course for everything that followed. One laugh, one sentence that cut deep enough to make me question myself, and ironically, strong enough to make me find myself. If there's anything I've learned from this journey, it's that people's doubts are often just reflections of their own limits, not yours. When someone says you can't, they're usually talking about themselves. The road wasn't easy. There were nights I thought about giving up. Mornings I woke up to silence and wondered if anyone would ever believe in me. But every setback whispered something important. Keep going. And eventually, keep going became my prayer, my mantra, my armor. When you're building something from nothing, you'll face laughter, judgment, maybe even betrayal. But none of that defines you. What defines you is what you build anyway. I think about the younger version of me sometimes, sitting at that desk, holding back tears after being dismissed. I wish I could reach through time and tell her, don't let their laughter define your ceiling. Let it fuel your foundation. Today, I walk into boardrooms where my voice carries weight, where ideas once ignored now shape decisions. But even with all the progress, I never forget where it started. Not in an office, not in a meeting, but in a single decision. To believe in myself when no one else would. Because that's where every success story begins, with belief. And sometimes belief sounds like defiance. Sometimes it sounds like a whisper. Sometimes it sounds like silence that refuses to quit. If you're reading this and you've ever been laughed at for dreaming too big, remember, the world doesn't laugh because you're wrong. It laughs because it's afraid you might be right. So dream anyway, build anyway, walk into the room anyway, even if your hands shake. Because one day, those same rooms will open their doors for you. And when they do, you'll realize it was never about proving them wrong. It was about proving to yourself that you always had what it takes. The man who laughed once taught me a lesson he never intended to, that sometimes the best revenge isn't victory. It's becoming the kind of person who doesn't need revenge at all. And so, if my story leaves you with one message, let it be this. When they laugh, smile back, because someday that sound won't sting anymore. It'll just remind you how far you've come. 3 months.